As we get started, I want you to consider a question. Are you a person who trusts others easily? Or do you find it hard to trust? On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being you trust no one, and 10 being you would follow just about anyone, anywhere, how would you rate yourself on this trusting scale? Right now, because I want you to really consider this. I want you to look down at your hands, and I want you to hold up the number of fingers that represent where you would fall on the scale of 1 to 10. Just looking down at your hands right in front of you. Keep looking at this number. Consider, are you sure that this is the number? On a scale of 1 to 10, how trusting are you? And then, would you just be willing to share with the person next to you, with one of the people next to you, maybe people on both sides? Just hold up your fingers to them and just give each other a knowing nod. Look around. I should see some heads turning as you're looking at each other's hands. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Psychologists and scientists who study human goodness will often say that trust is the foundation for what they call pro-social living, what we might just call love of neighbors. In other words, the more you are able to feel safe and secure with people, whether they deserve it or not, the more likely you are to regularly show care for others in concrete ways. For instance, you're more likely to assume the best about someone that you've just met if you're higher on this trusting scale, which immediately raises the likelihood that in any new encounter, that other person will feel warmly connected to you. The more that you trust people in general, the more likely you are to be attentive to somebody who's in front of you. The more willing you are to empathize with them, taking on their perspective and maybe even experiencing a little bit of what they might be feeling. The more you trust, the more likely you will be grateful for the person in front of you, and the more likely you are to then offer them compassion if you find them in need. And the more likely you are to offer them forgiveness if they have wronged you in some way. To say all of this a different way, lower levels of trust equal less capacity to love others, to offer love to others. Because at its core, offering love to others is risky. And if you don't trust, you won't be willing to risk. This really shouldn't surprise us that much. In some ways, because we just read Luke 24. Luke 24 is really like a pivot chapter, a pivot point between Luke's gospel and the book of Acts. The first 23 chapters of Luke are all about Jesus, right? His birth, his life, his ministry, his death. These chapters are all about the love that God has for the world, seen in Jesus. And then the book of Acts is about the church. The birth, life, ministry, and death of the church. The church is born of the Spirit of Jesus. The church lives a life of love. The church serves both God and neighbor, and the church lays down its life for the world. So what we see in Jesus chapters 20, what we see in Luke in the first 23 chapters about Jesus, we then see in the people who identify with Jesus in the book of Acts when Acts takes over the story. But we're left with this huge question, right? Like, how? How do we get here? How does God pull this off? Because how do these bumbling, stumbling disciples that we've been reading about in Luke, how do they, these disciples that Jesus calls, we just heard it, foolish ones, who are slow of heart to trust, how do these disciples become this community of radical love and care? It all hinges here. Luke 24, where God raises Jesus from the dead. God shows off his power. I mean, in this passage, we discover what we heard Brian just affirm as he was setting up the passage, that death has no power over the God of the universe. Death has no power over his son or apparently his plans. Humans use death as a weapon to defeat the Son of God, to defeat Jesus, or so they think they've defeated him. But death is nothing compared to the power of life that exists in God. And God brings Jesus back from the grave. And Luke 24 tells this story, but when we pay close attention to the story that's being told, we realize that it's not just the resurrection that changes everything. Yes, right? God has raised Jesus from the dead. Yes, death has lost its power over our lives, its hold over us. Something new has started in the risen Jesus, and Paul will later write letters announcing this new thing that's begun. But the resurrection of Jesus apparently doesn't just automatically do things to the disciples that fix them. All right, the disciples have to begin to trust the God who raised Jesus from the dead. And in chapter 24, we just heard, trust is nowhere to be found. Now, we could start at the beginning of chapter 24 and walk through each moment where the disciples are said to lack trust. But I'd rather start at the end and go backwards for funsies. In verse 36, the disciples have all come back together. They've reunited in Jerusalem. The 11 are together, and some others have gathered with them. And now the 2 disciples who walked to Emmaus have now come back and are with them as well. And you can picture the setting. They're all in this space together, and they're exchanging stories about what's been happening all day long. Those who stayed in Jerusalem for the day, they have some big news to share. Simon has now seen Jesus raised from the dead. This is a big deal. And the disciples who went off to Emmaus and came back, right, they have big news as well. They tell their story of their walk with Jesus and their meal with him where he broke the bread and their eyes were open. And what this means is that this entire group of disciples now has heard this group of women who found the tomb empty, met these divine messengers who told them that Jesus has been raised. They all have this experience. And now these disciples have just heard stories from each other of 2 distinct appearances of the risen Jesus. And Luke tells us that in this very moment, while they're all sharing these stories with excitement, Jesus appears among them. And Jesus immediately notes that they're troubled by his presence and that their hearts are full of doubt. He shows them his hands and his feet, proof that it is him there in the flesh, which then makes the next verse, he's already shown them his hands and feet. Verse 41 then is all the more shocking because as the disciples see Jesus in the flesh, as they listen to him talk directly, it says they still disbelieved. And I don't know what you think of when you hear the word believe. The way we usually use the word believe is it's a way of describing things that our brains accept as true. Right? Like that we accept as maybe having happened or could happen. Some of you believe right now that the 49ers will win today. Ugh. And some of you believe the Chiefs will win today. And some among us believe that, the Raiders are the greatest team of all time. And I mean, there's just a lot of beliefs at work in this room. Teresa, you didn't have to laugh so loudly. That was hurtful. I mean, thinking about the way we use the word believe, like, do you believe that maybe there are aliens that exist somewhere in the universe? Do you believe that humans and dinosaurs maybe have lived at the same time? Do you believe that you could be healed of a terminal illness? These are the ways that we usually talk about believing. All of these kinds of belief, they have to do with whether our brains can get a hold of an idea, and then there's some conviction that the idea is true somehow. But Luke 24 is dealing with a different kind of belief. And we get a hint of it in how Jesus engages with his disciples as they lack this belief. Notice Jesus has already shown them proof that he's alive. He's already shown them his hands and his feet. He's already said, "Touch me and see." But seeing, they still disbelieved. And so Jesus goes somewhere else. He's done proving anything to them. And so he just hangs out. And he does what people do when they hang out. He takes food and he eats it. Just the kind of thing that normal living people do. He's not necessarily trying to prove anything. But he says, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you." And so what Jesus does to meet them in their disbelief is point them back to the past. He reminds his disciples what he already said to them back in the past. He's done showing them he's alive. He's just alive. There's nothing else that he can do to prove. If they don't believe, if they can't wrap their minds around seeing him, there's nothing else he can do for them in that moment. At this point, it doesn't really matter if they can accept what they're seeing. What matters is what they do with Jesus' words. Right? It's not, did he say to them? It's, do I trust them? The word that we often translate as believe is often translated better as trust. Some translations capture this meaning, this idea. And actually, I just will challenge you. This next week, we're going to be reading in Acts. And as you read in the book of Acts, just change the word anytime you come across believe and see how it affects your reading if you swap in the word trust in the place of believe. Because you will find that at least at one level, believing doesn't really require much of me. I either believe or I don't. Something happens in my brain that either accepts or doesn't. But trusting requires me to respond. Trusting is demonstrated through a response, an obedience, a following. And we can do this here in Luke 24, substitute out believe for trust. The women, they come back to the disciples in verse 11, and they tell them all that they've seen and they heard. But, right, verse 11, these words seemed to them an idle tale. They did not trust them. Ooh, there's some really interesting implications. Why didn't they trust these women? And then for the disciples on the road to Emmaus, Jesus calls them fools for not understanding. But then he says they're slow of heart to trust all that the prophets have spoke. Right? Notice that in each of these instances, there is a relational break. Right? Someone's words are not trusted, which is why the word trust is so heavy here, because trust is a relational word. The disciples, they don't trust the word of the women. The disciples, they don't trust the words from the prophets. And now, here at the end of Luke, we're told that the disciples are still lacking trust. And we know that this is a trust issue because Jesus doesn't do anything to them, doesn't try to prove anything to them. Jesus simply focuses their attention on words that have already been spoken. Right? First, it's his own words. Remember what I said? But even there, he doesn't stop with what he says. He reminds the disciples that while he was with them, he kept teaching them that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Notice what Jesus has done. He has just been raised from the dead. But he doesn't say, look at me, right? Like, here I am. Like, let's look at resurrection. Like, he doesn't focus on the thing that has just happened. Instead, he takes the people all the way back to the beginning. He says, remember Moses. Jesus is convinced that if you read Moses the way that Moses is supposed to be read, you will see clearly that God promised all along that he would show up for his people in this way. Read Moses rightly, and you will see this is what God was always going to do. Then Jesus follows up Moses with the prophets. He says the same thing. Jesus is convinced that if you read the prophets the way the prophets are supposed to be read, you will see clearly that God promised all along that this is how he was going to show up for his people. And then after the prophets, it's the Psalms, the writings. In other words, what Jesus is doing, these three sections of the Hebrew Bible, Moses, prophets, writings, he's saying that they reveal over and over again a God who has always loved his people just as the disciples have now seen Jesus love them. Let me explain. This God is a God who loves his people. This is a God who from the very beginning humbles himself and allows himself to suffer at the hands of his people. This is a God who is never ultimately destroyed by his people, but again and again rises in strength, proving himself to be more than the very worst that his people can offer. Yet, this God, rather than returning destruction for destruction, reveals that he is a God who forgives. He is a God who invites his very attackers to turn from their violent ways and to be in relationship with him, the one that they have been attacking. And this is the God who is not just the God of a particular people, but the God of all people. And he is worthy of worship, not just from his people, but from all people. And so those who have been forgiven by him are then the first and the principal witnesses and announcers of what has happened to them, what their God is like as they move into and throughout all of the world, announcing that this is who God is and this is what he does. From the very beginning, from Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, this is who our God is and what he is like. When Jesus says Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms are written about me, he means to say that he, Jesus, is simply humanity's most recent experience with the same God who has been revealing himself throughout all of the scriptures. Now, this experience of God in the flesh is new for sure. Like, we have a theological word for it because it's so new. Incarnation. This is God's first time showing up in flesh quite like this. So it is a big deal. But in another respect, it's actually nothing that new. This is always the way that God has been showing up, revealing who God is and what God is like. Nothing about the character of Jesus, nothing about the work of Jesus should surprise anyone who knows and trusts the God of Israel. The God who has been described throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, the Bible that the earliest followers of Jesus had and meditated on. So I'm not sure if you noticed this as we listen to our reading, but this is now 3 times in Luke 24 that the disciples do not trust. But also, it's the 3rd time that a lack of trust is met with an invitation to go back to words that have been spoken in the past. So to the women, what do the messengers say? They say, remember how Jesus told you. And the women remembered his words. To the men on the road to Emmaus, he reminds them that all that Moses and the prophets and the scriptures had spoken about himself, he reminds them of this. And one of the things that Jesus is demonstrating is that trust is built over a long period of time, which is one of the reasons why many of us are not very good at trusting. One of the primary sort of theories of human development that's kind of dominant in some of the social sciences right now is that the kind of parents that we had, the presence of safe and secure parents, or the lack of trustworthy parents can be a huge factor in whether we are able to trust others or not as we grow into adulthood. These same researchers, though, have named that nurture, the way that we're raised, isn't destiny. Right? We can become more trusting as we are in relationship with people who are safe, secure, and who keep their word. Knowing that, you can see how this might be the turning point for the disciples, not just because of what Jesus has done in this moment, but as Jesus cultivates in them this deep sense that God has been consistent from the very beginning. As Jesus walks them through God's character from the beginning, you get the sense that it begins to cultivate in them a new ability for them to trust. The church will demonstrate profound trust in God, but also a beautiful trust in one another, in the way that they share their resources and the ways that they push one another, spur one another on toward love and good deeds. They become people who can trust God in radical ways, which allows them to then love their neighbors in profound and radical ways. I think this is one of the reasons why the early church devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings, right? The apostles were the ones who were there on that day, the ones who had been taught directly from Jesus how to see God's faithfulness from Moses to the resurrection. The apostles had been trained directly by Jesus to see how faithful and trustworthy their God is. And so these early followers, they didn't just read their Bibles. They devoted themselves. They devoted themselves to knowing this story of God's faithfulness through the generations. Think for a second of some story from your family. Can you think of any story from your family that's been passed down a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations? Can you think of any examples, any stories that have come down? And maybe later consider why that story endured, why it stayed in your family, why it keeps getting told. And then consider this community's devotion to the apostles' teaching. They knew they had to grow in their trust. And to do that, they had to obsess over the object of their trust. They needed to obsess over the story of their God and his faithfulness to the world and to them. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching so they could grow in their trust, so they could listen to Jesus and do what he was calling them to. And so the question for us as we read Luke 24 is, do we find ourselves still lacking some of the trust that would enable us to love more fully? It's okay if we do, because Jesus is inviting us to come close. Jesus is inviting us to come near to him so that he can tell us again the story of his Father's faithful love. He keeps his word. He is true to his character. And so we don't have to be afraid. We are loved, and death has lost its sting.